racist judge, unaware that the man he's targeting is a federal prosecutor. With courage and steadfast determination, he rises to challenge not only the judge, but the entire judicial system, fighting not just for himself, but for the rights of an entire community. Before we begin this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. Now, let's dive in. 8:17 a.m. on a frigid winter morning, Michael Thompson parked his silver sedan in the lot outside the Montgomery City Courthouse in Alabama. The weak, early sunlight did little to chase away the biting chill in the air, and Michael adjusted his scarf before stepping out of the car. Today, he wasn't here as an accomplished federal prosecutor, but simply as a citizen seeking to defend his family's rights. The issue at hand was an unjust parking fine tied to his mother's old car, a vehicle that had been part of their family for generations. Michael had spent days gathering documents and evidence to prove that the fault didn't lie with his mother. To him, this wasn't just about a fine, it was a matter of honor and responsibility. They can't keep bullying those without a voice, he muttered to himself. Dressed in a light gray suit and a blue tie, Michael looked every bit the polished gentleman, but inside, he was tense. An urgent call from his assistant at the federal prosecutor's office had thrown his morning into chaos. A major financial fraud case required his immediate attention. After swiftly reviewing and emailing his input, he left the office and rushed to the courthouse. As Michael stepped into the courthouse hallway at 8:45 a.m., he was immediately struck by the bustling, crowded atmosphere. Local residents lined up, clutching stacks of paperwork, hurriedly preparing for their hearings. He glanced at his watch. Just 15 minutes left. Following the signs, Michael made his way to courtroom 305, where the name Judge Henry Wallace was etched on a brass plaque. Entering the room, he found the atmosphere tenser than he had anticipated. Judge Wallace, a middle-aged man with silver hair and piercing eyes, sat high on the bench. Known throughout the city for his stern demeanor and sometimes subjective judgments, Wallace exuded an air of authority that filled the room. Michael took a seat near the back, observing the anxious and tense faces around him. Several people entered late, yet no one seemed to notice. An elderly woman in a red coat whispered a soft apology as she slipped into a seat near the front, drawing no attention at all. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something shifted in the air when his name was finally called. 9 a.m., Judge Wallace's voice rang out. "Michael Thompson," he called, his gaze piercing as if trying to unravel every word before it was spoken. Michael approached the podium with a calm yet confident demeanor, carefully placing his folder on the table. "Good morning, Your Honor," Michael began. "I have documentation here that demonstrates the parking fine was issued in error. I'd like to present." Wallace cut him off immediately. "You're late," he said, his tone cold. "This court does not tolerate disrespect for its time." Michael furrowed his brow but remained composed. "Your Honor, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to an urgent matter at the federal prosecutor's office." Wallace interrupted again. "Spare me the excuses. I am fining you $500 for failing to adhere to this court's rules." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Michael glanced around, noticing the injustice. The elderly woman and the young man who had arrived late earlier were not fined or even reprimanded. A simmering anger rose within him, but he suppressed it. "Your Honor," Michael said, his voice steady, "I believe court rules should be applied evenly. May I ask, on what basis is this decision made?" Wallace shot him an icy glare. "Are you questioning my authority?" the judge demanded, his tone sharp. Michael responded with unwavering calm. "No, Your Honor. I simply wish to ensure that everyone in this courtroom is treated equally." The room fell into a tense silence. Wallace banged his gavel firmly on the bench, signaling an end to the exchange. "Next," he barked, but the charged atmosphere lingered, impossible to ignore. Michael returned to his seat, knowing full well this wasn't over. Quietly, he began taking notes, his resolve evident in his steady gaze. This wasn't just a fine anymore. It had become a symbol of the injustice he could not overlook. As the hearing concluded, Michael didn't leave immediately. He stayed, observing how Judge Wallace handled other cases. A young white man, who had clearly arrived later than Michael, received a polite nod from the judge without so much as a reprimand. Meanwhile, a middle-aged black woman contesting a traffic fine, was cut off by Wallace, his tone laced with disdain. Michael clenched his jaw, the blatant injustice unmistakable. As he exited the courtroom, Michael opened his briefcase and pulled out a small notebook. He began jotting everything down: the judge's words, the defendant's expressions, and the stark discrepancies in how they were treated. This isn't just a one off incident, he thought to himself. This is systemic. On his way back to the office, Michael called his colleague Sarah Jenkins, a civil rights attorney known for her relentless advocacy. "Sarah, we need to talk," he began, urgency evident in his voice. "I think I just witnessed something we can't ignore." There was a brief pause before Sarah responded, "I understand. Meet me at the office at noon and we'll come up with a plan." Michael hung up, a mix of anger and determination surging within him. This was no longer just a personal matter. He knew that if he didn't take a stand, this injustice would continue to crush those who couldn't defend themselves. Michael met Sarah at her office that afternoon. Sarah, a well-known civil rights attorney with a reputation for taking on high-stakes cases, listened intently as Michael recounted the events. When he finished, Sarah leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful frown crossing her face. "Judge Wallace has been suspected of bias before," she said. "I've heard stories about him from minority communities here in Montgomery, but no one's ever had the courage to stand up to him. If you're going to take him on, we'll need concrete evidence." Michael nodded. "I've already started taking notes, but I need to gather more, not just from this morning's hearing, but from other cases as well. I'm convinced this isn't an isolated incident." Sarah proposed a plan. She would help Michael compile public records of Judge Wallace's decisions from the past 5 years. Meanwhile, Michael would reach out to other individuals who had experienced unfair treatment to collect their testimonies. Within just a few days, Michael and Sarah uncovered several alarming patterns. In cases involving defendants of color, the average fines were 3 times higher than those imposed on white defendants. Additionally, complaints from minority individuals were often dismissed without consideration. Determined to learn more, Michael decided to meet with local residents. He visited Clara, a middle-aged woman who had been fined $1,000 for a parking violation, despite clear evidence that the traffic sign in question was faded and illegible. Clara recounted how Judge Wallace had not only ignored her evidence, but had publicly humiliated her in court. "I felt like I didn't matter at all to him," Clara said, her voice trembling with tears. "It was such a horrible feeling." Clara's story was just one of dozens Michael documented. News of his quiet investigation began to spread through the community, prompting more people to come forward and share their experiences. Michael and Sarah decided to present their evidence to the Alabama Judicial Review Board. However, when news of this reached Wallace, he reacted immediately. One morning, Michael received a sudden summons from the court. Wallace had ordered him to appear for a hearing, accusing him of disrupting court proceedings. Sarah was furious. "He's trying to intimidate you, but we're not backing down." The hearing took place in a small courtroom where Wallace presided directly over the proceedings. The judge attempted to turn the hearing into a personal attack, but Michael held his ground, responding with calmness and truth. As Michael presented documents and data highlighting the inequities in Wallace's rulings, the tension in the room became palpable. Lawyers and court staff seated in the audience began whispering among themselves, the weight of the revelations impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, a local journalist, Jenny Carter, caught wind of the story. Jenny launched her own independent investigation and published an article detailing the evidence of Wallace's bias. The piece sent shockwaves through the community, quickly going viral on social media. Human rights organizations took notice, calling for an official investigation. In Montgomery, small protests began forming outside the courthouse. People held signs with slogans like "Justice for All" and "End Injustice Now." Michael became the center of public attention, but he refused to give interviews, staying focused on building a solid legal case. As the pressure mounted, Wallace began to lose control. During another hearing, he openly threatened a young attorney who dared to question his bias. This action angered many of Wallace's colleagues, and some quietly began leaking information to Michael's team. Eventually, the Judicial Review Board announced the launch of a formal investigation. Despite Wallace's attempts to justify his actions, he was forced to step down temporarily while the inquiry unfolded. This marked Michael's first significant victory, but he knew the real battle was far from over. The Judicial Review Board's investigation began with the summoning of witnesses and an extensive review of Judge Wallace's court records. Sarah and Michael prepared a comprehensive report, complete with data, testimonies from victims, and legally obtained audio recordings from previous court sessions. These pieces of evidence painted a stark and undeniable picture of Wallace's decades-long pattern of bias. Michael spent countless hours preparing his statement for the board. He understood that this was not just a chance to expose injustice, but an opportunity to advocate for systemic change. Meanwhile, Wallace launched a campaign to defend himself. He enlisted high-profile attorneys and appeared in the media, claiming to be the victim of a political witch hunt. As the investigation progressed, Michael faced mounting pressure. His family began receiving anonymous phone calls with threats, and one evening, someone intentionally shattered the window of his car while it was parked outside his home. Sarah urged Michael to be more cautious. "I don't want you to become a target," she said, her eyes filled with concern. But Michael remained steadfast. "If we stop now, who will stand up in our place?" he replied firmly. At the same time, Michael received an outpouring of support from the community. Letters, emails of gratitude, and even small tokens of appreciation were sent to his office. One letter from a high school student particularly moved him. "I don't know much about the law, but I know what you're doing is right. I hope to become a lawyer like you one day." After weeks of investigation, the Judicial Review Board held a public hearing. Michael and Sarah presented their evidence with precision and determination. Sarah, with her exceptional oratory skills, guided the board through each case, highlighting the clear patterns of bias in Wallace's rulings. As witnesses took the stand, their testimonies left the hearing room in stunned silence. A young man recounted being heavily fined for a minor traffic signal violation, while his white friend received only a warning for the same infraction. An elderly woman became emotional as she described how Wallace had made her feel humiliated and belittled in open court. The highlight of the hearing came with the testimony of James Carter, a former court clerk who had worked under Wallace. After years of staying silent, James decided to reveal what he had witnessed. He told me outright, "Don't waste your time on these people. They're not worth it." James said, his gaze fixed firmly on the board. Under unbearable pressure, Wallace was forced to resign before the board could issue its final verdict. A brief statement was released. "I believe stepping down from this position is in the best interest of the community." However, his resignation did not absolve him of legal accountability. The board forwarded its findings to judicial authorities for a criminal investigation. Outside the hearing room, crowds gathered, cheering loudly upon hearing the news of Wallace's resignation. For the Montgomery community, this marked the first step toward restoring trust in the justice system. Following this event, the state of Alabama implemented major reforms in its judicial system. Mandatory training on unconscious bias was introduced for all judges and court staff. Additionally, an independent commission was established to monitor and review rulings that showed signs of irregularities. Michael became an unexpected symbol of the reform movement. He received invitations to speak at legal conferences, universities, and community organizations. In every speech, he emphasized that this victory was not his alone, but belonged to everyone who had dared to raise their voice. "Justice isn't just what's written in the law books," Michael said during a speech to a packed auditorium. "It's about how we treat one another, especially the most vulnerable among us." A year later, Michael returned to the Montgomery courthouse. The courtroom, once presided over by Wallace, was now led by a young, fair-minded judge. Near the entrance, a small plaque had been mounted reading, "Justice is the foundation of freedom. Without fairness, there can be no peace." Michael stood still for a moment, taking in the hope reflected in the changes around him. A court clerk approached and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up." Michael smiled. "Thank you for believing in change." Michael Thompson's story serves as a powerful reminder that each of us has a responsibility to ensure that justice is not just words on paper, but a living reality in our daily lives. If you feel moved and inspired by this story, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more touching stories like this. Thank you for watching. Goodbye, and see you next time.